Welcome to Musing, music, conversation, and inspiration for the adventurous listener here on CJSW 90.9 FM in Calgary. My name is Janna Sailor, and it is my pleasure to be your guide on this deep dive into contemporary Canadian music. Let's get started. Canadian composer Emilie LeBel has been described as a creator whose music reflects her intelligence and audaciousness and is impressively subtle and sensuous. I should mention that first quote was from none other than Sir Andrew Davis. LaBelle's work inhabits sonic worlds of textural landscapes, resonance, and variances in color, and her postings include composer with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, composer in residence with the National Youth Orchestra of Canada, and Soundmakers composer in residence with Soundstreams, just to name a few. Emily, such a pleasure to have you here on Musings today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So I recently had the pleasure of delving into one of your latest projects entitled Field Studies. And first of all, congratulations. It's absolutely stunning. Tell me about this project and the inspiration for it. Can you walk me through the pieces on the program?
For sure. So the CD came out last year. I shouldn't say last year now because it's 2025. It came out in 2023. And it was a project that really combined, I like to say, sort of old friends and new friends. So there's 3 tracks on the recording, on the album, that feature local Edmonton artists, performers. And then there's 2 pieces that were written for colleagues back in Toronto, where I lived for a long time before I moved out this way. So 2 of the pieces were written before 2015, and they sort of bookend the album. They start and finish the album. And then there's 3 pieces in the middle that I wrote specifically for artists here in Edmonton. So Ultraviolet Ensemble, and then a duo for Alison Belchettis and Chanel Anderson. And then that final track that makes up the album also features Jane Barry singing with Ultraviolet. So each of those pieces was written 2020 through to 2022, specifically for them. And then we had the pleasure of recording them before we premiered them, just such were the circumstances in the world at the time. And we recorded them here in Edmonton, and then the 2 other pieces were recorded back in Toronto. And then put all together onto this album. And the sort of thread that connects them all is relating to the natural world in different ways. So topics sort of vary, but they all have this sort of connection to my surroundings in various places that I've lived over the past 10 years.
Should we start with Evaporation Blue? And this is a piece for piano and harmonica. And I can't say that I've come across very many pieces for piano and harmonica. Tell me about this sound world and that you've created.
So that piece was commissioned by Cheryl Duval, who's a piano player based in Toronto and works a lot with living composers. So when I was thinking about this piece, I wanted to do something to sort of unpiano the piano, so to speak, or do something a little bit different with solo piano. And I can't even remember now how I sort of came to the place of harmonica and piano together, but I actually really loved the warmth of that reedy sound with the piano, and it sort of became a way to change the envelope of sound in the piano, because there's sustained to a certain extent in piano, but it is a percussive instrument. And so the harmonica was sort of a way I could create almost a sense of drone or a different sense of sustain. And I knew Cheryl would be up for trying something a little bit different, because essentially she had to learn a whole new skill to play another instrument while she's also playing piano. And there's some real tricks with that, because with harmonica, certain notes you're drawing air in and certain notes you're pushing air out or through the instrument. Right. And what we discovered is it's actually quite difficult to play piano and draw air in at the same time. So, a few challenges there to overcome and work on, but she was just brilliant to work with, and premiered the piece, and then has played it a few times since, and then we were able to record that in Toronto.
And it's so effective. I was just struck by the spaciousness and the atmosphere that was created. That was both strangely like transporting but comforting at the same time. That was my sense that in experiencing the work. So let's move on to the next one. And the higher leaves of the trees seem to shimmer in the last of the sunlight's lingering touch of them. And that sounds like a line from a poem or some writing.
Mm-hmm. It came out of a book, and I now can't remember off the top of my head the title of the book, and then I changed it a bit. But this sort of beautiful scene depicted, those like never-ending summer days. And then for those of you who don't live sort of in the more northern side of Canada, in May and June here in Edmonton, and actually in Calgary and a lot of places around here, we have these never-ending days where it's still light out at 10 or 11 p.m. And there's just something kind of magical about the way the light lingers. And if you're sitting out in your garden here, it's something I've never quite experienced until I moved here. So there was really a sort of a moment I wanted to capture, but also sort of a sense of nostalgia or lingering. And then really there was no program note for the piece because the title just sort of became the program note as well.
Right.
But one of the ensemble members, Shinoa, who lives in Edmonton too, has this amazing, beautiful backyard garden, and I've sat in there in the evenings, and so it was a little bit of a nod to her garden and sort of that magic of sitting there on long summer evenings.
Yeah, she's playing on this track. That's beautiful. Tell me about your relationship with the ensemble Ultraviolet.
So they're an ensemble based here in Edmonton, and I always sort of say for a city of now 1 million people, we don't have a lot of groups that specialize in working exclusively with living composers. They're it, and they're amazing at it. And they're some of the first people I met when I moved here. So, for people who have moved to a new place, it's a bit, it feels a bit uncertain at first, and it takes a while to sort of find your people in your community. And I just found the community here, it's small but so welcoming, and so they were people I met almost immediately, and have been to many of their concerts and got to know them as people. And so it was really special then to be able to write them music knowing who they are rather than, so, I mean, it's always lovely to write people music, but it is really special when you know the individuals and you've heard them play a number of times. Something different happens in the studio when you're writing music and get to know them that way. And then subsequently I actually just finished a piece for Shinoa, the flute player, that's a solo flute and electronics piece. And so it's nice to be able to continue that conversation and get to know them better and continue to write music with all that knowledge of having worked with them.
Yeah, that's a beautiful reciprocal relationship between artist and composer. And I wish everyone could be that fortunate to, have a composer best friend that can write them incredible pieces of music about inspired by their backyard gardens. And the next track is Drift, once again featuring Ultraviolet, this time with Jane Barry voice, and Roger Admiral on piano, Shenoa Anderson flute, Allison Balchetis on baritone sax, and Mark Seeger on percussion. Tell me about Drift.
So Drift, was, I'm trying to decide where to start on this one. Written deep in the pandemic. We all had lots of time, or at least I didn't have a lot of time, but I had a lot of time by myself because I was living by myself at the time. So this is one of my forays into writing my own text to set to music, which has been a really exciting thing for me. I had sort of dabbled in it a little bit in a previous commission, and then really decided that was the direction I wanted to go with this piece. And then Jane Berry, I didn't know terribly well, but I had heard her sing with a vocal ensemble here in town, and beautiful voice, lovely human. So what an amazing opportunity to write something specifically for her voice, her range, her interests. And then she has a relationship with Ultraviolet too. So again, we talk about community and reciprocal relationships. There was just a lot of goodwill and excitement from the get-go. So written for her and the ensemble, and I'm trying to think what else I can tell you about it, because you'll probably hear an excerpt of it. But was interested in a piece that was shaped by the pacing of the text, if that makes sense, rather than it being sort of a standard form. It's quite through composed, but there's a number of different sections within that, and not really a lot of material that returns in the same way. So a bit of a nod to the idea of a through composed art song, but definitely not art song.
And was that a bit of a departure for you in writing, art song? Is that a genre that you're comfortable working within?
Oh, so for a long time, I didn't write for voice. Okay. And so there's sort of a whole backstory here that actually relates to a project I'm working on right now. But in school, when I was studying composition, we didn't really get specific classes on writing for voice. And I think that's still quite common. You take a class on orchestration and you learn all the instruments in the orchestra. But unless you sort of take the initiative to go seek out working with singers, you don't really get a lot of knowledge in writing for voice in particular. And it's such a specific and different medium from anything else we write for. So for the first part of my professional career, I didn't write for voice and didn't really have a lot of opportunities to write for voice. And then I was commissioned, I can't even remember what year this would have been, like maybe 2015, somewhere around there, by a group called Women on the Verge. And just had such a good time working with them and writing this piece for them that they're all now friends. Oh, wow. And that sort of ignited an interest for me in writing more for voice once I had a really positive experience, and I think learned a lot through their generosity. So now so then I went on and wrote this piece, Drift, but one of the ensemble members, Elizabeth McDonald, she teaches voice at U of T, and this year I'm actually working on a larger art song project with her and her students, and working around the idea of writing for singers that are still growing their voice, and sort of what are the differences between writing for a professional level singer and an emerging singer. And so we're sort of partway through the project right now, and by the end of this year, I'm going to be writing a little sort of ebook on writing for voice, writing for art song, and then what are the special considerations for writing for the emerging voice, in hopes that composition students will then have another resource so that they'll be excited about writing for voice and have a few more ways into it, even if the curriculum at their school doesn't have a particular class on writing for voice.
Wow, that's fantastic. And then in turn, your works will be part of the journey of these young developing singers growing into their voice and into their confidence and profession. That's really so fascinating.
Yeah, and they've been so much fun to work with. So I've had a ball in their classes, just observing the sorts of things that come easily, what they struggle with, what sort of subjects they're interested in singing. So I'll be back there at the end of February again to work with them, and I think interesting for singers too to learn a little bit about what goes into composing.
Absolutely.
So that when they're working with composers, they have the skills to communicate what they need out of that relationship too. It's been a year-long project, sort of September of 2024 to June of 2025, and so probably by September of this year, I'll have a series of 5 to 8 art songs for the emerging voice, and then sort of a preliminary document on writing for voice, and then from there, I'll develop it further and then make it available for others.
familiar trail to reassure myself. Still, 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 still. Silence brushing my fingertips over So this next track, even if nothing but shapes and light reflected in the glass, and it includes electronics.
Hmm.
Tell me about this and your relationship with merging electronics with acoustic instruments.
Oh, this was such a fun piece to write for Allison and Shanoa. So they do some work together as a duo, and they
Mm.
both play all the different variations of their instruments, right? So Shanoa plays alto flute, and Allison plays all the different saxophones. So I got really excited about the idea of baritone saxophone and flute together. Um, and then they each play a lot of contemporary music and work with composers a lot, so they're kind of game for trying things. So um, this particular piece, I was just starting to explore tactile transducers on percussion instruments. So tactile transducers shake, so they're like a speaker, but they sometimes they're known as bass shakers too, but you can send sounds through them and they'll vibrate. So when you put them on things like a big bass drum head, you get all this sort of resonance of the drums. And then if you put that in an interesting room, it becomes even more sort of curious and with all these beautiful colors, because it'll adapt to the resonant frequencies of a room. So that was what I was interested in exploring in the piece, and a bit of a learning experience for me working with tactile transducers instead of speakers, which is what I'd done in the past, working with electronics. So it's the two of them, and then on the fly they're being processed through a series of electronics that I have, and then being amplified through these transducers. So you sort of get like this really washy sound in the background of them playing live. And then if you hear it live, you get this sort of sense of everything being spatialized around the room, because I can put these drums in all these different corners of the room, and then you're sort of immersed in the sound in quite a different way. So it sounds immersive on the recording on two channels, in stereo as you listen to it, but then it's a bit of a different experience in the concert hall.
Right.
So that was really fun to put together, and they were really generous with their time so that I could figure out sort of how all the sounds would come together into something that sounded really cohesive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when you're introducing these kind of extended elements that are, outside of most musicians' expertise and perhaps comfort zone, how do you prepare your musicians to, tackle this and take this on? What kinds of instructions do you give in the score? Do you, have conversations with them prior to, delivering the score? How does that work?
That's a really interesting question, and a good question, because I think it really depends on the project.
Mm.
The pieces we're talking about on this album, there was opportunity to try things, and just to contrast that, when you get commissioned to write an orchestra piece, you have to know that everything's going to work, because you're probably going to get 20 minutes of rehearsal. Your piece gets read through twice. There's a chance to fix a few things, and then it's good to go for a concert. So there's not a lot of room in those situations to try something new or indecision.
Right.
You need to go with what's going to work. So there's lots that you can do within that, but there's sort of a practical element. This sort of project, I was really blessed by the fact that there was chance for experimentation, chance for changes, to ask for input, to be able to pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I'm thinking of this. Are you comfortable with this?"
Right.
So there was a lot, in a way, asking for consent,
Right.
rather than showing up to the rehearsal and having a finished score and saying, okay, this is what we're doing. But then within that, once we had tried some things, the score is pretty standard notation, and then and then there's always some performance instructions in the front of the score that maybe clarify a few things. But most of what I'm asking them is fairly practical, and because they're all quite versed in playing a lot of contemporary music, they've been asked to do weirder things and harder things before.
Right.
If that makes sense. And I think the line I always sort of think about, and I often say this to students, is you never want to ask anyone to do something that hurts or makes them sound bad.
Yes.
So you always want to be thinking about that, right? The sort of, what are we asking them to do physically? And, we want them to not feel like they're being put in a situation where they don't sound good or it's uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, really important for that, it to be a healthy interaction with your music. Yes, I concur. As a musician that's performed a lot of new music and been asked to do a lot of things. I was always happy to stretch myself to a point, but I think that's really great advice for musicians and the musician composer relationship to remain healthy. Absolutely. So the final track is Further Migration for solo violin. Tell me about this.
So this is a piece I developed when I got to participate in a program called New Nord, which is sort of an exchange between Canadian composers, performers, and UK composers and performers. So I actually had the opportunity to write this piece, and then in the summer of 2016, I went over to the UK along with some of my Canadian composition colleagues, including two very good colleagues who were part of a collective with me called Blue Moss Ensemble. And the piece was written for Mira Benjamin, who's Canadian and lives over there. And then they all came over here and we presented the piece, all the pieces that we worked on in Vancouver, Victoria, and on Salt Spring Island in Canada. So it was a pretty amazing project, just in that, again, this idea of like being able to develop a piece and talk to the performer, work on ideas, revise the piece a few times. And this was probably my first foray into thinking about microtonality, and that's one of the specialties of Mira. She did her dissertation for her doctorate on this. So she was a real wealth of information and advice when I was working on this piece. And then I have a lovely colleague in Toronto, Ilana Walniak, who then subsequently took on the piece and learned it as well. And she is the one who is on this particular recording. So the piece has had a bit of a life, and then we changed some things and adapted some things in the piece for Ilana. So I like that there's been a chance for the piece to sort of evolve as I've learned and had different performers play it. But definitely like the most angular and different piece on the recording, and it's the piece that's the oldest. So, if you're drawing sort of a timeline through all these, that's sort of where my current music came from and how it's evolved and changed a bit since then.
Wonderful. So what were your greatest influences as you were developing your aesthetic and your compositional voice and your approach to writing?
Oh, another good question. Well, I think in a very sort of general sense, I when I was in school, I was living in Toronto, and when you live in a city like that, it's not just the school you're at and the people you're studying with. It's very much the community around the school and the colleagues you're at the school with. But living there, I was able to go see 1, 2, 3 concerts every week because there's just such a volume of music there. And so I think there's new music concerts, and there's sound streams, and there's Continuum, and there's the Toronto Symphony. So I think that deeply impacted my development, just seeing like the scope of possibility, and that not everyone needs to sound a certain way or write a certain kind of music. There was just so much going on. There was really all sorts of different things that resonated with me. And then I studied with some really interesting and different composers. So when I did my master's degree, I studied with David Mott, who also is a baritone saxophone player. He's a composer and a Zen master. And
wow,
so often,
a triple threat.
Triple threat.
Not very many of those in the world. A Zen master, sax player, composer.
No, and he had a dojo, and he no longer lives in Toronto. He's retired since then, but he had a dojo too, right? So wow. A really interesting human, not just in the music he created, but in the sort of life he had there, and lessons often, talked about canoe trips and foraging for mushrooms and all these other things that were sort of adjacent to the music. So that was really special for me at that time. I didn't know who I was yet. I didn't know what I wanted to be writing, but he really created a space where you could just explore and try things and not be sure. There was just room for uncertainty, which was really nice. And then when I did my doctorate, I studied with Gary Kulesha at UT, and how could he not have a profound impact on your writing? He is such a good teacher and has taught so many composers in Canada, and just has a way of sort of seeing who you are in your music and being very supportive of that and what your aesthetic is or what your developing aesthetic is, but also being very demanding of refining your craft and really asking questions and really digging into the detail and making sure it all makes sense. So I think that was a really nice contrast. It's sort of a more cerebral approach, if you will, after sort of this openness. So, not just their music impacting me, but also who both those teachers were as humans and what they offered that way was really important to my development. And then, I think composers, we spend so much time in school, and then when you're done, you're still figuring out who you are. Mm-hmm. So I think from there, I traveled, and I lived down in Montana for 3 years. And then after that, I moved here to Edmonton. And I think just living in some different locales and seeing a bit more of the world helps sort of solidify what I'm after aesthetically and who I am. That all takes time.
Mm-hmm. You said something really interesting, and I'd like to get your take on it a bit more. How important is it for composers to have that safe space in which to create and explore their compositional voice, and how do you create that?
Oh, that's that's like the eternal question, and I think every teacher kind of thinks about this in a different way. For me, I feel like if my students leave my studio sounding like me, then I haven't done my job. I don't want them to sound like me. I want to help them figure out what their sound is. But at the same time, I also want to push them a little bit beyond what they're comfortable with, to try some new things, even if it isn't maybe totally what they want to sound like, to just try push their boundaries a bit, in a respectful way, but that sort of balance of being encouraging, but also pushing people to just take a little step towards something different or unknown, or listen to a piece that's a little bit different from the kind of music they always listen to, but being really encouraging of who they are, what their life experience is like, and how that's going to be reflected in their music. And I don't know if I have all the answers yet, but that's sort of what I strive for, to be accepting and welcoming, give them space to try things and to fail, because that's how we learn. Those times where maybe the piece doesn't work out quite the way we wanted, or there's some things that didn't work very well, but then we carry that all forward to our next piece, and then our next piece is more successful because of those moments of conflict or failure, or things that didn't quite work out. So being really supportive, not just of the product, the finished product, but that process of trying things.
Mm-hmm. And in a similar vein, how does your life experience impact you as an artist, a creator, an educator?
Well, I'm not sure I have a good or clear answer to that, but I started composing I like to sort of say a bit later than a lot of people. I didn't really start composing until my late 20s. So I bring some different life experience to my practice, just because I did some other things. I played trumpet, and I studied audio engineering, and I worked in a piano store for a while, and I did all these other things, and then went back to school to study composition. So I think that shaped me a bit, in that it wasn't like this really linear, clear path that this is what I was going to do. But I also think that impacts how I teach others, that not everyone has the same opportunities, the same experiences, and how can we be accepting and welcoming to students, and sort of give them a space wherever they're at to try composing. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, we're all on our journeys, and we arrive, often at unexpected destinations along the way. Especially the thing, life in the arts, it's constantly evolving, and it's fascinating to listen to our individual journeys. So, what is next for you artistically, and what direction are you headed in?
Well, I'm sort of in the midst of a few. Well, I mentioned earlier this art song project, which has been sort of my main all-consuming project since September. Writing the text for that and working with the students. This year, I'm actually on leave from teaching, so my life has looked a bit different since September, because I'm not preoccupied with teaching, and I go back to teaching next year. So I've got some other projects on the go. I'm working on a 30-minute string quartet for Quattrobasini in Montreal. So that's what I was chipping away at yesterday. And I've got a piece I'm going to be starting in a little bit. It's for chamber ensemble and electronics. So some of the electronics on field studies is sort of the next step. Working with the same setup and kind of seeing how I can refine it and change it. And that'll be for Continuum Ensemble, which are based in Toronto. And then I guess the other sort of exciting thing, it's done, but it's not out in the world yet, is I I recorded a piece with the Toronto Symphony in November of last year. So that'll be coming out on Harmonium Mundi in, I think, sometime this year. So it's 2 pieces by Bartok and then a piece by me. So that was pretty exciting to be in Toronto for the recording of that, and then they'll be editing all of that and putting it out into the world later this year.
So where can people hear your work and connect with you in the weeks and months ahead?
In addition to field studies, I had another album released last year called Landscapes of Memory. And both of those were released on the label Redshift, and they have a Bandcamp page. So if folks go there, both albums are there for you to listen. And if you are so inclined, you can purchase them for download. Or there's also, if you're one of those people who owns a CD player, CDs exist as well. And then actually tomorrow in Halifax, I have a piece being played. And then in Calgary, February 1st, they're doing the whole Field Studies album is being presented by New Works Calgary. So that's sort of the next local concert happening.
That'll be fantastic. New Works Calgary, shout out to them. They do a wonderful work promoting local artists and Canadian artists and composers, and that will be just a wonderful exploration of your work, and we'll make sure to put that information up on our socials and the show page. Thank you so much for joining us today, Emilie. It's been such a pleasure to take a deep dive into this latest project in advance of the February 1st performance here in Calgary.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really lovely chatting with you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for being on Musing, and we'll keep our eye on you and ears. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Musing on CJSW 90.9 FM in Calgary. My name is Janna Sailor, and it's been such a delight to share music and ideas with you on this platform. Musing is a production of the Canadian Music Centre Prairie Region and is produced on the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 nations, which include the Siksika, Kainai, Pekainai, Stoney Nakoda, Chiniki, Bearspaw, Goodstoney, and Tsuut'ina nations, and the Métis Nations 5 and 6. To take us out, here is the music of Emilie LeBel.